So I love that verse that's on screen. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. You can read. And that's where I really want to focus. Let me start by telling you a story. It's about a guy who in my world of preachers is very famous. His name's Fred Craddock. When Fred was growing up, his mother took the kids to church and Sunday school. Father didn't go. He complained about Sunday dinner being late when mom got home. Sometimes the preacher, the minister would call and their father would say, I know what the church wants. Church doesn't care about me. Church wants another name, another pledge. Another member, another donation, right? Sometimes there'd be special events, a music concert, a shared supper. And Father would say, the church doesn't care about me. The church wants people's names and pledges. Fred said he probably heard his father say that 1,000 times as he was growing up. And then there was one time he didn't say it. He was in the Veterans Hospital and he was down to 73 pounds. They'd taken out his throat and said, it's too late. They put in a metal tube. X-rays burned him to pieces. Fred flew in to see his dad. His dad couldn't speak, couldn't eat, swallow. Fred looked around the room. Potted plants, cut flowers, home-baked cookies, food everywhere, on all the windowsills, a stack of cards 20 inches deep beside his bed. And even, that rolling stand in the hospital rooms where you can put your dinner tray on, it was covered with a flower and with gifts. And all of the flowers beside the bed, every card, every blossom, every gift and box of cookies were from people, individuals, or from groups in the church. Fred's dad saw him pick up a card and read it, and he couldn't speak. So he took a Kleenex box from the tray, and he wrote on the side of it a line from Shakespeare. He wrote, "In this harsh world, draw your breath in pain to tell my story." Fred looked up and said, "What is your story, Dad?" And his father wrote on the bottom of the Kleenex box, "I was wrong." At the end, Fred's dad began to understand that he was loved and cared for, and it was the ordinary people of that church that finally got the message through, that delivered the message. Not the preacher or the priest, not the hired pro. It was the rest of the congregation, all of them, who ministered to Fred's dad. That's the way it should be. At least that's how the reformers thought it should work. Every follower of Jesus is a minister, a priest, each with tasks that fit our unique personalities and skill set. The thing is, the people of God haven't always thought like this. We've yo-yoed back and forth on this, up and down. If you go back 3,000 years to the early days of the Hebrew people, our ancestors in the Old Testament, some of you remember those stories from Sunday school, there was a clearly identified priesthood. A select few who worked in the tabernacle as they moved through the wilderness, and then in the temple when they finally got to Jerusalem. And there were links. Those priests were the link between God and the people. The priest was the mediator between them, between God and those people who had escaped slavery in Egypt and weren't sure about this high and holy God, a God of Ten Commandments and smoke and fire and lightning on the mountain. But 1,000 years later, after Jesus had come, the thinking had evolved. They began to see things differently. And they began to actually say Jesus was our high priest, who once and for all is the mediator between ordinary people and the holy God. Just one priest. All believers are part of. And one great high priest, Jesus. Letter to Timothy, there is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. And so as all believers, we have access. We have direct access to God now through Jesus. You don't have to go through me or Katie or anybody deemed special. You have direct access to the holy God through Jesus. And the reformers got it. They understood this. Listen to Luther. There is no true basic difference between laymen and priests, princes and bishops, between religious and secular, except for the sake of office and work, but not for the sake of status. All are truly priests, bishops, and popes. That was pretty radical in 1530. You're all popes, bishops, priests. So how does that play out today in 2017? You have these two ministers ordained to word, sacrament, and pastoral care. That's our title, our job description. So it can seem a little bit fuzzy. And we do have unique roles. Katie and I are what I would call resident theologians, teaching elders. Sometimes one-to-one, we get to talk with you and explain or teach something, sometimes in groups or to the full congregation like this, the full community. We have that role. However, the decision-making is with the whole congregation. And the governing and authority is in elected members, people chosen and elected by the whole congregation. People who are committed to Jesus and the community and who are growing in spiritual maturity, wisdom, and graciousness. I hadn't thought of doing this, but I could ask the members of the board to stand right now. I think I will. Penny, you're in the front row. I thought I saw Jeremy come in. Here's board members. All right, they've been elected by you, and they make the decisions. Katie and I do not have a vote officially. All right, you guys can sit down and relax. I won't center you out again. But let me tell you how that plays out. You know I have a lot of colleagues, ministers. Well, there were 75 ministers here 10 days ago for Ministry in Motion. And I'm always connecting with, so I want to use a case, and I'm going to fudge the details so you don't know who it was or where this happened. But one of my colleagues was telling me about a really hard decision they had to make in their congregation earlier this year. They had to let a staff member go, and it was another minister. And they had that's hard, but it just wasn't working out. So they had a congregational meeting, and the recommendation was brought to the congregation, and there was a lot of emotional speeches made, and somebody finally stood up near the back and said, "Who is this board? Who are these people that made this recommendation that are asking us to approve that we release this person?" And so, like you folks, the board stood and they came down to the front. There were 8 of them. They came down to the front and they just stood there. And the person asking the question said, "I know these people. I trust them. That's why we elected them. maybe we should go with their recommendation. While all that was going on, the other minister, was sitting at the back and with head down for 90 minutes, an hour and a half during this meeting. Head down, just praying. Never said a word. And it was the congregation and the board who have the authority to make those hard decisions. That's an example of how the body of Christ functions together. If, as Luther says, there is a universal priesthood. We're a team of equals. Katie and I have different job descriptions, but the power and authority is with the community. Within the Protestant Reformation, that's where we decided to go. It's not hierarchical. So how is that expressed? And I want to say to you, it's about a call to purpose. I'm going to use a word here, and I think John will throw it on screen, vocation. John, do you have that? There it is. A vocation, a divine call to God's service or to the Christian life, a function or station in life to which one is called by God. There's a religious vocation, there's the vocation of marriage. You're called by God into this role and this job description. And all of us have a godly vocation. Quote from Professor of Theology at Princeton: "The vocation of a Christian is not to be confused with having a job by which one earns one's livelihood. Whatever one's job or profession, as a Christian, one is called to be a partner in God's mission in the world." This is what Luther was talking about, the priesthood of all believers. We are partners in God's mission to the world. So each of us, as Jesus followers, has a calling, a vocation to serve, to lead, to oversee, depending what you're assigned to or elected to or volunteer to. And that, my friends, can be done by anyone at any age in astonishing ways. Let me tell you about Ruby Bridges. Back in the 60s, in the deep south of the U.S., Ruby was the first black child to attend an all-white school in her city. All the other students were boycotting the school in protest. Ruby went to school alone, one little 6-year-old black child. She was escorted by federal marshals with revolvers on their hips, men in dark suits. The city and the state police had refused to protect her, to walk into the school. The president sent federal marshals in to line the sidewalk so this little 6-year-old girl carrying her lunchbox could walk in. And she had to walk through the midst of a mob of white people who were screaming obscenities, yelling threats, waving their fists at her. She walked this gauntlet every day, attending an empty school to sit alone all day in her classroom. So what did Ruby Bridges do in such daunting circumstances? A Harvard child psychologist was doing research, and he got permission to talk with little Ruby. Do you know what she did? She prayed for herself that she would be strong and unafraid, and also for her enemies that God would forgive them. Quote, "Jesus prayed that on the cross," she told Dr. Coles, as if that settled the matter. "Forgive them because they don't know what they're doing." Now, in another school in another neighborhood in the same city, 3 other 6-year-old black girls were attending against similar opposition. And Dr. Coles interviewed them too. He got to know Tessie, especially, and her grandmother. Tessie's grandmother would get her ready for school, and every morning when the federal marshals came to the door to pick her up, grandmother would open the door, look out and say, "Lord, another day, another gift. Lord Almighty, another gift." And then she would hand over little Tessie, who carried her lunch pail to school between the men in dark suits with revolvers on their belts. After 2 months of facing the abusive crowds, Tessie suggested that maybe she should stay home. Her grandmother delivered a lecture to her little granddaughter. "You see, my child, you have to help the good Lord with his world. God puts us here, and God calls us to help him out. You belong in that school, and there will be a day when everyone knows that, even those poor folk. Lord, I pray for them. Those poor folk who are out there shouting their heads off at you. You're one of the Lord's people. He's put his hand on you. He's given a call to you, a call to service in his name." A little 6-year-old black girl is called by God to help end segregation? Really? Yes. That's what Martin Luther was talking about in his idea of the priesthood of all believers. A chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into God's marvelous light. Let me flip back to that theology professor I was quoting a moment ago. He explains it so well. God calls Abraham, chooses the people of Israel, summons the prophets, sends Jesus of Nazareth, commissions the followers of Jesus for service in the world. That's us, folks. Christian life is more than acceptance of the forgiveness of sins and more than personal transformation. It is also the vocation to participate in the preparation of all creation for the coming of the new community of justice, freedom, and peace in partnership with the triune God. There's work to be done, a message to be proclaimed, service to be rendered, hostility to be overcome, injustice to be rectified. And we acknowledge that in our We Believe statements. I don't have them printed on your bulletin cover today, but the 7th one says this: "We believe each Christ follower has spiritual gifts that give true meaning to living and strengthen our shared ministry." We're all ministers. We're all priests. Let me go in another direction. I want you to think, remember, to people maybe you've known in your past, people you remember from your church. Do you have a scrap of paper, a pencil? Maybe grab your bulletin, use the margin. I want you to write a name. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you. Shut your eyes and think of a name. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you. Write it down. File it hard in here. Choose a name. You remember it. Have you written any? Do you have one or two? Keep a list. Keep the list, because for you, it's not just a list. In fact, the next time you move, keep this, what you're writing. Even if you have to leave your car, your books, your TV, your computer, and everything else, keep that. In fact, when your living and serving has ended and you leave the earth, take those names with you. I know you can't take it with you. When you get to the gate, St. Peter's going to say, Now look, you went into the world with nothing. You've got to come out with nothing. So what do you got there in your hand? And you'll say, well, it's just some names. Well, let me see it. Well, it's just some names of folk I worked with and folk who helped me out. Well, let me see it. It's just a group of people that if it weren't for them, I wouldn't be here. And he'll say, I want to see it. And you'll give it to him, and he'll smile, and he'll say, I know these names. In fact, on my way over here, I saw some of these folks. They're painting a great big sign to hang out over the street for you. And it says, welcome home. I think I have an advantage or a little bit of a head start on this list. When I was a little boy, let me just tell you right now, when we were talking this through with the worship planning team, and I said, here's how I want to go at the end. Juanita, the music director at 11, heard it, and she said, I'm laying odds he won't get through without tearing up and choking up. So that's my warning. When I was a little boy, my dad served several churches, one up in the Ottawa Valley, one over in Huron County. There was a quilting group at one of the churches. Women who got together and stitched and sewed patchwork quilts. Have you seen some of these? Have you ever? When we were leaving one of those churches, the ladies got all different people throughout the congregation to take a square home and stitch their own name into the square. And then they took all of those patches and put them together and made a big quilt with names of all of these people. So when I was growing up, I slept under that quilt. Blanketed by names, dozens of names. Violet Bender, my grade 3 Sunday school teacher. Carl Ostreicher, a farmer with huge calloused hands. He used to pray most Sundays in our Sunday school. He'd pray for individual children. He'd pray for missionaries that we were supporting across the ocean. I can hear his prayers 50 years later. That quilt has stayed in our family now. It's closing in on 60 years. It's been shared around, passed. My brothers have had it. I grew up sleeping under it. I asked my brother John on Friday where it is, and he said, it's in Regina now. My niece has it. If it ever comes back to me, because it's going through the family, if it ever comes back to me, I can add some names now of others in the churches I've served who've been part of my list of the Priesthood of All Believers. Holly Lister, first church I served in New Brunswick. Eleanor Eisler, church in Port Colborne. Herma Bailey. Does that ring any? I have other names. They warm my heart and they blanket my soul. They're names of a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. Thanks be to God. Amen. Amen.